I work at a remote border station in Texas. There's something ST range about the night shift.
The posting came through on a Tuesday, which I remember because Tuesdays were the days the regional HR system ran its automated job match notifications, and I'd been getting them for 6 weeks without finding a single thing worth applying to. 6 weeks of alerts that went nowhere. 6 weeks of positions that required certifications I didn't have, or locations I couldn't get to, or pay grades that didn't cover rent and the truck payment at the same time. 6 weeks of the particular quiet that settles into an apartment when the work has stopped and the days have started running together at the edges. The alert came in at 11:47 in the morning. I was eating cereal at the kitchen table because cereal was what I had, and because the effort required to make anything else felt disproportionate to the reward. The subject line read, Border Infrastructure Support, Remote Posting, Valverde County. Department of Homeland Security contract, routed through a private logistics firm called Meridian Field Services, which I'd never heard of, but that didn't mean much. The DHS runs a significant percentage of its ground-level border infrastructure work through contract intermediaries. That's standard. That's just how the money moves. I read the posting 3 times, not because it was complicated, because I was looking for the thing that would tell me not to apply. I didn't find it. The position was listed as Border Support Technician, which is a title broad enough to mean almost anything, and in my experience, titles that broad usually mean the work is either too dull to describe specifically or too variable to pin down ahead of time. The duties listed were maintenance and monitoring of remote sensor equipment along a designated border corridor, coordination with federal agents as needed, facility upkeep at a fixed station location, and overnight shift coverage 4 nights per week. The station was described as a fixed structure with full utilities, climate control, and communication equipment. Vehicle provided. Housing stipend included, though the posting noted that most technicians preferred the station's on-site quarters for practical reasons, given the commute distance from the nearest town. The nearest town was Del Rio, Texas. The station was 67 miles from Del Rio, which, in that part of the country, means 67 miles of 2-lane road through country that doesn't apologize for what it is. I knew that stretch of Valverde County a little. Not well, but enough to understand what 67 miles meant out there. It meant you were not going to drive into town for dinner. It meant the on-site quarters were not a preference. They were a fact dressed up as a choice. The pay was good. Better than good, honestly. Better than anything the automated system had sent me in 6 weeks, by a margin wide enough that I read the number twice, and then read it a 3rd time with my finger actually on the screen to make sure I was reading the right line. I applied that afternoon. The interview was a video call with a woman named Sandra Reyes, who had the title of Regional Staffing Coordinator for Meridian Field Services, and who conducted the whole conversation with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done it many times and had long since identified which parts of it actually mattered. She asked me about my technical background, which was solid enough. 6 years of field instrumentation work, 2 of them with a border surveillance contractor out of San Antonio that had since been absorbed into a larger company. I knew sensor systems. I knew the specific kind of boredom that comes with remote monitoring work and how to manage it. I knew how to stay useful when the job's primary requirement was being present and paying attention. She asked about my comfort with isolation. I said I was fine with it and meant it. I've always been better alone than most people assume, and most of the work I've done has been in places where alone is the baseline condition, rather than the exception. She asked if I had any concerns about the posting's remote nature. I said I didn't. She asked one question that I've thought about since. She asked whether I considered myself someone who trusted their own perceptions under conditions of low stimulation and extended solitude. She phrased it differently than that, more HR, more careful. Something about maintaining accurate situational assessment during routine monitoring periods. But that was what she was asking. Whether I trusted my own senses when there was nothing to confirm them against. I said yes. I said it without hesitating. She made a note on whatever she was looking at off-screen and said the position would likely be offered pending a background check and a reference verification. She said Meridian would be in touch within 5 business days. They were in touch in 2.
The background check cleared. The references checked out. The paperwork arrived in my email as a PDF the following Monday. 43 pages of it, which is not unusual for a federal contract position. I read all of it, which I know most people don't do, but I've signed enough contracts in enough remote locations to understand that the pages you don't read are the ones that matter when something goes sideways. Most of it was standard: confidentiality requirements, equipment protocols, communication procedures, liability waivers that covered everything from weather events to equipment malfunction. There was one clause I read twice. It was in Section 28, buried between a paragraph about vehicle maintenance reporting and a paragraph about the schedule for site inspections. It said that the employee acknowledged awareness that the posting location fell within a designated federal sensitivity zone as defined under the relevant Homeland Security statute, and that any observations made during the performance of duties that the employee deemed unusual, anomalous, or inconsistent with normal operational parameters were to be reported through the established internal reporting chain before being communicated to any external party, including, but not limited to, media representatives, personal contacts, or social media platforms. I read it twice, and then I moved on. That clause is not unusual in border security contracts. You're working near sensitive infrastructure. You're near federal operations that run on discretion. The language is standard. The logic is sound. I signed the contract. I packed what I needed into the truck on a Sunday morning and drove south toward Del Rio, and then out of Del Rio on a 2-lane road that narrowed by degrees. And by the time I'd been on it for an hour, the asphalt had developed that particular quality of roads that carry very little traffic, smooth in the middle and rough at the edges. The kind of road that the state maintains just enough to justify its existence on a map. The scrubland out there has a particular beauty that takes some getting used to. It's not a landscape that offers itself up. It's all creosote and lechuguilla, and the particular gray-green of vegetation that has made its peace with not having enough water. The sky is enormous out there, in a way that feels almost aggressive. The way open space can feel aggressive when you're used to having things between yourself and the horizon. And the Rio Grande corridor cuts through it with a kind of indifference to the significance that people have assigned to it. Just a river in dry country doing what rivers do, which is move water from where it is to somewhere else. I pulled into the station at 4:15 in the afternoon. The light was already going orange and long the way it does down there in the fall, throwing shadows that stretched 3 times further than the things that made them. The station was a compound, which is the only word that fits. A main building, low and wide, constructed from the same pre-engineered metal building systems you see at agricultural operations and light industrial sites all across that part of Texas. Tan exterior, flat roof, small windows high on the walls. An equipment shed to the west of it, a vehicle bay with 2 spaces, one occupied by a white Ford F250 with government plates. A chain-link perimeter fence with 3 strands of barbed wire at the top, which is standard for any federal facility in that corridor. 2 cameras on poles at the corners of the fence. A satellite dish on the south side of the main building. A generator shed at the back.
The light inside the fence was good. High LED floods on 4 poles at the corners. The kind of lighting that costs real money to operate, but that you use when you need to see what's in the yard at 3 o'clock in the morning without having to think about it. Beyond the perimeter, the scrubland ran flat to the south toward the river, maybe 2 miles of open country before the land dropped toward the water. To the north, the terrain broke up into low caliche ridges covered in cedar and mesquite. Nothing dramatic, nothing you'd call a hill with any particular conviction, but enough to cut the sight lines. The road came in from the east and ended at the gate, and that was all there was. No other structures, no other lights. Just the station and the compound lights and the flat country in every direction and the sky doing what it does at that hour, which is shift through colors so gradually you keep thinking it's still the same color until suddenly it isn't.
He said it the way Alvin had probably said something similar to every new hire in that log yard. Come on in, I'll walk you through. Routine language, the language of handover, the language of one man passing a place to another man and beginning the process of that transfer. I got my bag out of the truck and followed him across the yard. The main building had 3 sections: the operations room at the front, which housed the monitoring equipment, banks of screens showing sensor feeds from the corridor, radar returns, camera angles from positions I'd learned the names of over the following days. The equipment was newer than I expected. DHS had clearly invested in this particular stretch of corridor, which told me something about what they thought it was worth watching. Webb walked me through the operations room quickly, naming things, touching things, the economy of a man who knew where everything was and had stopped thinking consciously about any of it. This screen handles the seismic array. This one's the thermal overlay. This is the communications panel. VHF, satellite phone backup, the radio to Del Rio sector. You log contacts here, in this field, with the time and the grid reference. You call Del Rio on this frequency for anything that requires agent response. He showed me the logging protocol. Every sensor trigger got logged regardless of what caused it. Wildlife, weather events, personnel crossings, sensor malfunctions, everything in the log. That's non-negotiable, he said, in a tone that suggested it had been negotiable for someone at some point, and that the result of that negotiation had not been good. The second section of the building was a kitchenette and a common area, a table, 4 chairs, a couch that had seen years of use and showed it honestly, a small television that I'd find out later got 3 channels reliably, and a 4th one that came and went depending on conditions nobody had been able to identify. A shelf of paperback books in the state that paperback books accumulate on remote postings, which is to say, random, well-read, and occasionally missing their covers. A coffee machine that was clearly the most important piece of equipment in the building, based on its central position and the obvious care that had been taken to keep it functional. The third section was quarters. 4 bunk rooms, each barely big enough for the bunk and a narrow closet and a small desk. 3 of them were currently occupied, based on the gear visible through the open doors. The 4th had clean bedding on the lower bunk and nothing else. Your room, Webb said, and moved on. There was also a bathroom with a shower, which I noted with genuine appreciation because I've worked in enough remote postings to know that a real shower is not something to take for granted. We came back to the operations room, and Webb sat down in the primary monitoring chair with the ease of a man returning to the exact spot where his body expected to be. He looked at the screens in the systematic sweep pattern you develop when you've been looking at multiple screens for a long time. Left to right, bottom to top, a count of 3 on each one, then start over. You don't even know you're doing it after a while. It becomes the same as breathing. I sat in the secondary chair and looked at the screens with him for a moment.
The other two people on the rotation, he said, are Diaz and Estrada. Rosa Diaz is a 12-year veteran with the contractor. She knows this station better than anyone, including me. Danny Estrada has been here 8 months. Good technician, quiet. He settled in fast. He said settled in fast in a way that I registered without knowing why. The same way you register a phrase that sounds like it should be ordinary and isn't quite, without being able to say immediately what's off about it. Schedule runs like this, he continued. Day shift, 6 to 18. Night shift, 18 to 6. We rotate so nobody's carrying nights more than 4 consecutive. Anything that happens on your shift goes in the log. Del Rio sector gets a status call at 0600 and 1800, regardless of whether there's anything to report. If there's a sensor trigger that looks like a crossing event, you call Del Rio immediately. Don't wait to see if it resolves. Call it in and let them decide whether to respond. He said all of this the way you say things that have long since stopped being new information. The way you say things because they need to be said to a new person, not because you need to think about them anymore. Then he said the first of the things. He said it while he was looking at the screens, not at me. Casual, the way you'd mention weather. He said that the station had good perimeter lighting, but that the coverage had a gap on the northwest side, between pole 3 and the equipment shed, and that when I was moving around the yard at night, I should use the path that ran along the east fence line, rather than cutting directly across the yard from the main building to the equipment shed. I asked why, because the direct route was obviously shorter, and I was the kind of person who asks why when the logic isn't immediately apparent. Uneven ground, he said. Drainage issue from last winter that they'd filled, but that settled wrong. You step on it wrong at night, you're down. He said it like a man who'd either seen it happen or come close himself. Made sense, filed it. I'd worked enough sites to know that the most dangerous parts of any facility were the mundane ones. The uneven step, the wet deck, the thing that nobody bothers to put a warning sign on because everybody on site already knows about it and they've stopped thinking about it as a hazard. We talked through the rest of the orientation for another hour. Fuel protocols for the generator, water supply logistics. They trucked it in from Del Rio on Tuesdays, so you needed to be thoughtful about usage toward the end of the week. Equipment maintenance schedule. The procedure for communicating with the Border Patrol agents who came through periodically, sometimes announced and sometimes not, which was a federal agency thing and not something we had any input on. At the end, he said the second thing. He was closing a binder, and he said it while his attention was still on the binder, which made it feel like a minor afterthought. He said the radio on the northwest sensor array sometimes put out a signal that the interior equipment read as voice transmission, a specific frequency quirk that the techs in Del Rio had been trying to diagnose for years without resolution. And that at night, especially in the hours between midnight and 400, I might hear what sounded like voices from the speakers in the operations room when there was nothing on any of the sensor feeds to account for it. He said it was a known equipment issue, and that the correct procedure was to log it as a sensor anomaly and continue monitoring. He said it was easy to get turned around by it if you weren't expecting it, but that once you knew it was a quirk, it stopped being a problem. I wrote it down in my field notebook. Radio frequency anomaly, NW array 0000 to 0400, log as sensor anomaly. Practical, specific, already solved. That's the kind of information that's worth writing down. He said the third thing as he was showing me out of the operations room toward the quarters section. He said it the way you say something you've almost forgotten to mention and are catching at the last moment. He said that the station had an interior protocol on lighting that was worth knowing about. The operations room stayed on full illumination during night shift because of the screens, obviously. But the rest of the building, the common area, the kitchenette, even the individual bunk rooms, should be kept lit during the overnight hours. Not brightly, just on. A lamp, a hallway light, the kitchen fluorescent. He said it was a security protocol, something about presenting a consistent occupancy signature on the thermal feeds, so the station looked active rather than sleeping to anyone surveilling it from outside. He said some of the previous technicians had gotten in the habit of going fully dark when they turned in during night shift, and that it had caused problems with the exterior monitoring interpretation. Made complete sense. That's exactly the kind of operational subtlety that you don't put in a manual because you assume it's obvious, and then discover it isn't. Keep the lights on during overnight. Maintain the occupancy signature. Simple. I filed it alongside the path thing and the radio thing. 3 pieces of practical information from a senior man. The kind that lives in a place for a long time and knows where the floor is uneven. I put my bag in the bunk room. I ate with Webb and Diaz in the common area. Diaz was a compact woman with close-cropped hair and a quality of attentiveness that reminded me of certain people I'd worked with who were very good at their jobs. She asked me 2 questions during dinner, and they were both about my technical background and both precise. The kind of questions that tell you the person asking already knows enough to evaluate the answers. Estrada wasn't there. He was on the tail end of a night shift, and Webb said he'd be turning in once I'd had a chance to meet him.
He came through at around 7. Estrada was younger than I'd expected, maybe 28. He had the look of someone who had recently lost some weight without planning to. The kind of subtle hollowing around the eyes and jaw that happens when a person hasn't been sleeping or eating quite right for a while. But he moved normally. His handshake was fine. He asked if I'd found the coffee machine, and when I said yes, he nodded with the satisfaction of a man confirming an important fact about the universe, and went to his room. Webb said goodnight at 8. I had the first day shift starting at 0600, and the sensible thing was to sleep. I put my field notebook on the desk in the bunk room and looked at the 3 entries I'd made. East fence path at night, uneven ground. Radio anomaly, northwest array, midnight to 0400. Log as sensor anomaly. Interior lighting on during overnight hours. Occupancy signature. I turned the desk lamp on and left it on the way Webb had said to, and got into the bunk. I lay there for a while, listening to the station settle around me, the hum of the generator, the low electrical undertone of the monitoring equipment in the operations room, the distant sound of the air conditioning system cycling. The sounds of a working facility doing what it does when nobody's actively doing anything. No wind. The scrubland out there absorbs sound in a way that forest doesn't. There's nothing to scatter it. It just goes flat against the dry ground and the low vegetation and the sky, and that's where it stops. I went to sleep without difficulty. I've never had trouble sleeping in new places. That's either a talent or an absence of imagination, and I've never been sure which. Day shift started normally. Diaz ran the 0600 status call to Del Rio sector with the efficiency of someone who could do it in their sleep and had probably come close. The log from Estrada's night shift showed 4 sensor triggers, 3 of which had been logged as wildlife, 1 as a sensor malfunction on the eastern array that had self-resolved. Clean night. Del Rio sector copied the status report and signed off. I took over the primary monitoring chair at 0615 after Diaz had walked me through the morning's sensor state. She was thorough without being slow, which is a specific skill. She showed me what to look for on the thermal overlay and what the normal baseline temperature variation looked like across the corridor at different times of day. She explained how to distinguish a human crossing signature from a deer or javelina signature in the radar return data, which was not as obvious as you might think because the animals in that country are large and numerous, and the crossing events are often small groups moving low and deliberately. "You'll make mistakes the first few days," she said. "Not judgment calls, technical calls, about what you're looking at. Just log everything and call Del Rio on anything that could be a crossing. Let them make the judgment call. That's their job." I appreciated that. Clear lane definition. Know your job, let other people do theirs. The day shift was what day shifts at monitoring stations are. Steady, repetitive, occasionally interrupted by something that required attention, and then resumed. I had 4 sensor triggers during my shift. 3 were wildlife, clear on the thermal. 1 was a legitimate crossing event, a group of 3 individuals moving northeast through a draw about 1.5 miles south of the station. I called Del Rio with the grid reference and the direction of movement and the description of the signature. Del Rio copied and said they were putting a unit on it. 20 minutes later, they called back to say the unit had made contact. Case closed. Log it. That was the whole of the day shift. I ate a sandwich at noon. I drank too much coffee and then not enough water and had a headache by mid-afternoon that went away once I corrected the water situation. I read the station log for the past 30 days during a quiet stretch, which was something I always did on new postings. The log was the institutional memory of the place. It told you what the station considered worth recording and what it considered routine, and those 2 things together told you more about a place than any orientation document. The log was thorough. Webb ran a tight log. Every trigger, every status call, every maintenance item, every equipment anomaly. There were entries for the radio frequency issue on the NW array, exactly as he'd described it. Flagged at varying times between midnight and 0400, logged as sensor anomaly, consistent across the past several months. A recurring note, just like he'd said.
The bunk room was fine. The desk lamp was on. The generator hum was where it always was. The AC had cycled off, which was probably what had woken me, the sudden relative silence. I lay there for a moment, taking stock of the situation the way you do in a new place, when wakefulness arrives unexpectedly. Everything accounted for, nothing wrong. From the operations room I heard a sound. It was brief, gone almost before I'd registered it, but it had been a voice, or something shaped like a voice. The particular cadence of speech, even through the wall, has a texture distinct from any other sound. Your brain is built to recognize it, and it recognized this. The NW array anomaly. Webb had told me about it. Log as sensor anomaly. I lay there for another minute and heard nothing further. Then I went back to sleep. In the morning, I logged it. 0213, NW array. Possible voice transmission anomaly. No corresponding activity on sensor feeds. Logged per protocol. Diaz looked at the entry when she came on at 0600 and said, "It gets everyone the first time. You stop hearing it after a while." I said I didn't hear it now. She said good, and made the Del Rio status call. The second week settled into pattern, the way remote postings settle into pattern. The rhythm of shift change, and status calls, and sensor monitoring, and the small maintenance tasks that accumulate on any facility that's running continuously. I became comfortable with the equipment at the pace that competence requires, which is faster than training expects and slower than you wish. Diaz and I developed the shorthand of people working toward the same operational goal in a small space. Webb and I developed the respectful distance of a senior man and a new one who have established their respective lanes and are content to stay in them. Estrada I didn't get to know well, which I think now was because he was trying not to be known. Not in an unfriendly way, just in the way of a person who had decided to take up as little space as possible in a given environment. He did his shifts. He kept his log entries precise and frequent. He ate with us sometimes and said very little. When he smiled, it was the smile of someone making a conscious decision to perform normalcy rather than experiencing it. I notice this the way you notice things in a small group when there's not much else to look at. I didn't say anything about it. It wasn't my business. On the 9th day, I had my first overnight shift. It ran 1800 to 0600. Webb briefed me at handover with the specific items from his day shift. 3 triggers, all wildlife. Del Rio had done a scheduled check-in at 1600 that had been routine. The generator had thrown a maintenance alert at 1400 that had self-cleared but should be monitored. Everything else nominal. He said one more thing at the end of the briefing. He said it while he was pulling on his jacket, the way you say something you've almost decided not to say. He told me that overnight shifts sometimes had a quality he called compression. He said it in a way that acknowledged the word was imprecise. He meant that in the hours between midnight and 400 particularly, the particular combination of low stimulation, heightened attention, and physical fatigue could cause the perception of the monitoring environment to shift in ways that weren't entirely about the actual sensor data. He said experienced technicians learned to calibrate for it. He said the key was to go strictly by the instruments and the log, and not by what the perimeter felt like. What the perimeter felt like. I sat with that phrase for a moment. He said it like it was a standard operational concept, like felt like was a technical term in the vocabulary of remote monitoring work. And in some ways it is. Every technician who's done enough overnight shifts develops a peripheral sense of the area they're monitoring. Not mystical, just the accumulation of enough baseline exposure that deviation registers before you've consciously processed the data. Your body knows the pattern before your brain catches up. But he said it with the particular care of someone choosing words deliberately, not casually, precisely. I said I understood, and I did, or I thought I did. He left at 18:15, and I was alone on shift.
The first 4 hours of the overnight were quiet in the way that particular stretch of corridor is quiet on most nights. 2 wildlife triggers between 2100 and 2200 that resolved cleanly on the thermal. A check-in with Del Rio at 2000 that was 5 minutes of formality in both directions. The generator running steadily, the cooling system cycling, particular ambient electronic hum of a facility doing its continuous work in an empty landscape. I did the monitoring sweep that Diaz had shown me, left to right, bottom to top, 3 seconds per screen. I wrote in the log at regular intervals even when there was nothing to write, because that's the discipline required in remote monitoring. You're right, when there's nothing, because the act of writing keeps you in the process. It's the moment you stop writing when there's nothing. You've started the slide toward the kind of inattention that means you'll miss it when something finally happens. It was quieter than I'd expected. Or maybe not quiet, but diffuse. The operations room speakers were set to the standard monitoring volume, not loud, just present, and what came through them was in that same register, not a broadcast, not a transmission, something ambient, a texture in the audio that resolved, if you listened for it, into something shaped like speech. Not words I could make out, just the cadence of it, the rhythm of human language. I logged it immediately. 112 NW array, voice transmission anomaly, onset. No sensor activity on any feed corresponding to audio anomaly. I did another sweep, and another. The anomaly kept running, not constant. Okay, it fluctuated the way interference fluctuates, rising and falling without pattern. Okay, sometimes I was almost sure I was hearing words. Sometimes it resolved back into pure texture, almost electronic, almost natural, almost neither. At 0148, I did the building walk. Sound continued through the speaker while I was doing it, audible from the operations room as I moved through the common area. Stood in the common area doorway for a moment and listened to it through the wall. Okay. At that distance, it didn't sound like equipment anomaly. Okay. It sounded like someone talking in the next room. Went back to the chair. At 0203, it stopped. Not faded. Stopped. One moment present. Next moment, absent. Same clean cut that the Alvin story had described about the forest sounds, though I didn't know that story yet. I wouldn't know it for many weeks. Presence, and then nothing. I logged 0203 NWO array, voice transmission anomaly, cessation, duration 51 minutes. No corresponding sensor activity throughout. No personnel movement detected on any camera feed. Equipment, behavior consistent with previously documented anomaly, logged per protocol. Then I sat in a chair and looked at the screens and tried to account for the way my chest felt right then. Not fear, exactly. Or not just fear. Something more specific. It's a particular feeling you get when something that was supposed to be explainable has been explained and the explanation hasn't touched the actual thing. I had the NW array anomaly on 7 more overnight shifts during that month. Duration ranged from 18 minutes to 1 hour and 23 minutes. I logged every occurrence with time, duration, and a note about sensor activity during the period, which was always the same, nothing corresponding. The Del Rio sector tech I spoke with about it one morning said they were aware of the issue and had it on their maintenance list, but that it wasn't operationally significant and wasn't affecting sensor performance. Wasn't operationally significant. That's the language of a thing that has been looked at and filed. I started drinking less coffee during overnight shifts, which helped with the quality of the baseline. You don't want your own nervous system manufacturing noise that you then have to distinguish from actual signal. That's basic monitoring hygiene. I also started doing the building walk every 90 minutes instead of every 2 hours. This wasn't required, but which I found helped maintain the kind of active attention that overnight shifts erode. I read them. Item 1. Use only the east fence path when moving through the yard during overnight hours. Its ground on the direct route between the main building and the equipment shed is structurally unstable. It has been flagged to maintenance and has not been addressed. Do not use it, regardless of how much time is saved. Item 2. The NWA array radio anomaly is not equipment interference. I don't know what it is. I know that it is consistent, that it intensifies over time if you pay direct attention to it through the speaker system, and that turning the speaker volume to 0 during the anomaly period stops the intensification. Webb does not know I know this. Do not tell him you found this note. Item 4. You will hear your name called from the direction of the northwest ridge. It will come during or just after the NW array anomaly. It will be in a voice you recognize. It's the first time it will sound like Webb. By the 3rd or 4th time, it will have found a voice closer to you. Do not respond. Do not go to the window. Do not open any exterior door. It knows you heard it. Responding tells it something. I don't know what. I only know that not responding is the rule, and the rule exists for a reason. Item 5. If someone on the rotation goes to the northwest ridge during overnight hours, you will find out by their absence in the morning and not before. By the time you find out, it is too late. There's nothing you can do. Do not go after them. Item 6. The path to the northwest ridge is not on any site map. You will not find it on any official diagram. You will find it yourself one night if you look toward the ridge long enough. Do not look for it. Do not take it. If you catch yourself thinking that checking the ridge would resolve something, go back to the operations room and put your hands on the desk and look at the screens until the thought passes. Then I went back to the operations room, sat down in the monitoring chair, put both hands flat on the desk the way item 6 had said, and looked at the screens, left to right, bottom to top, 3 seconds each. Start over. I did not look toward the northwest ridge. Not that night. Not that shift. The anomaly came on at 0147, and I turned the speaker volume to 0, the way item 2 had said to. And I noted the time and sat with the silence and watched the screens and waited for it to end. I need to tell you about the card, about who wrote it, before I tell you what happened next, because the who matters. Okay. The who is the part that opened something up for me in the same way it must have opened something up for the person in the Canadian log yard when they found Alvin's laminated rules in the fire safety box. You find something like that, and the first question is always, who had to learn this? What did learning it cost them? Meridian Field Services had given me a staff directory on my first day. The kind of thing you file away and don't look at because you already know the people you're working with and everybody else is just a name. I found it in my field notebook on the morning after I found the card. Listed the current rotation and 2 names flagged as former rotation members who had completed their contracts in the past year. One of them was a woman named Terry Okafor. Contract end date listed as 14 months before my arrival, which put it within a week of the date on the card. I didn't contact Terry Okafor. I didn't have a way to, and even if I had, the contract's confidentiality clause was clear on what I was and wasn't allowed to discuss with former contractors. More to the point, I wasn't sure what I would have said, but I'd found her card, that I was following her rules, that I was beginning to understand in the specific and physical way you understand things that happen to your body rather than your mind. What she'd meant when she said keep every light on. I kept every light on. The second, overnight, after finding the card, the anomaly ran for 67 minutes. I had the speaker volume at 0 for the whole duration. I watched the time on the operations room clock, and I watched the screens, and I did not look toward the northwest ridge on any of the exterior camera feeds. That's a discipline you don't understand the difficulty of until you try it. There were 3 cameras with sight lines that included the ridge. I looked at them for their standard 3-second count, and I kept my eyes on the full frame, and I did not let them travel to the northern edge where the caliche rose and the cedar made its dark shapes against the sky. At 0231, the anomaly stopped. At 0233, a sound came through the exterior. Not through the speaker system, which was at 0, through the walls. The building was metal construction, pre-engineered, the kind of structure that's good at keeping temperature in, but not especially good at keeping sound out. I'd already learned this. The generator's maintenance alerts came through the walls. Wind did. Rain, when we had it. This came through the walls. It was a voice, not the texture of the anomaly, not the cadence-like interference pattern. A voice. My name, my first name, Cole, called once, clearly from outside. From the direction of the north side of the building, where the equipment shed was, where the direct path cut across the uneven ground toward the shed, where the northwest ridge sat beyond the perimeter fence, in the darkness that the compound lights didn't reach. I was out of the monitoring chair before I'd made any decision. My hand was on the door of the operations room, the interior door that led to the corridor, and then to the common area, and then to the exterior door. My hand was on it, and I was not deciding anything. I was just moving. I stopped. I stopped because of item 4. Not because I'd decided to stop, because the sentence was there. You will hear your name called from the direction of the northwest ridge. Do not respond. It knows you heard it. Responding tells it something. My hand was on the interior door of the operations room. I stood there with my hand on the door, and I did not open it. I made myself stand in the operations room with my hand on the interior door without opening it, and I counted to 30 in my head. At 30, I let go of the door handle. My hand was slightly cold. I looked at it for a moment. Then I went back to the monitoring chair, and I sat down and I put both hands flat on the desk surface, and I looked at the screens. The exterior was silent. The sensor feeds were clear. Nothing on thermal, nothing on radar. The camera feeds showed the empty compound, the dark perimeter, the scrubland beyond, in the IR wash of the lights. I looked at the northwest edge of the camera that covered the north side of the compound. I know I shouldn't have. Item 6. I looked anyway, not for long. Long enough to see that the fence line was clear and the ground between the compound and the ridge was empty, and the ridge itself was a dark, irregular shape against a sky that had enough starlight to define it. Nothing moved. I looked away. 233. Exterior acoustic event. Apparent voice transmission. North side of building. Name called. No sensor activity. Possible secondary expression of NW array anomaly manifesting through building structure. No action taken. Continued monitoring. I stared at that log entry for a moment after I had written it. Possible secondary expression of NWO array anomaly manifesting through building structure. That's the explanation the log required. Okay, that's the explanation that fit inside the vocabulary the log was designed to contain. I left it. It was there. It had to say something. In the morning, Webb read the log entry and made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been something else. He said, the anomaly sometimes bled through the walls at certain frequencies, that the building's structural resonance at certain temperatures could transmit it in ways that sounded localized and directional when they weren't. He said it with the same flat informativeness he always used. He said it looking at the log entry, not at me. I watched him read it, and I thought about item 2. Webb does not know I know this. Do not tell him you found this note. Whoever had written that sentence had known Webb long enough to have an opinion about him, had spent enough time in this station with this man to have made a specific decision about what he could and couldn't be told. That wasn't a casual assessment. That was the conclusion of someone who had watched and listened and arrived at a judgment. I said, it was the first time I had heard it through the walls, directly. Webb said, it'll happen again. You'll calibrate to it. He handed me the day shift briefing, and we moved on. I want to describe the Northwest Ridge properly, because I don't think I have yet, and it matters. It matters because the card told me not to look at it, and because everything in me wanted to, and because the tension between those two things was a texture of the next several weeks. The ridge is not dramatic geography. If you drove through Valverde County with no particular reason to stop, you would not stop for this ridge. It is perhaps 60 feet higher than the flat ground of the scrubland at its highest point. It runs roughly east to west for maybe half a mile before dropping back to grade. It's covered in ash juniper, which in Texas is commonly called cedar, though it isn't, and the juniper grows dense on the north slope and more scattered on the south face that looks toward the station. Between the compound's north perimeter fence and the base of the ridge is maybe 400 yards of open ground, flat, rocky, the kind of terrain that gives you no cover and no ambiguity. Okay, if something was crossing that ground in the compound's lighting or in any eye-archipel camera, you would see it. Nothing ever appeared on the cameras crossing that ground. The card's item 6 said the path to the ridge was not on any site map. I had looked at the site map. The site map showed the compound, the access road, and nothing else of significance. The region to the north was marked simply as open terrain with a topographic line indicating the ridge elevation, no path. But paths exist on the land before they exist on maps, and in dry country, a path shows itself differently than in forest. In scrubland, a path is the line where the latugawilla and the catclaw acacia are absent, where the rocky ground has been walked enough that the limestone caliche has been disturbed in a way that catches the light differently, where the direction of it makes a certain kind of sense that you feel before you identify. I had not been north of the perimeter fence. I was not going north of the perimeter fence, but I knew, in the way you know things you're trying not to know, that there was a line in the terrain between the compound's north gate and the base of the ridge, that the line was consistent, that it was the accumulated evidence of passage. I logged nothing about this because there was nothing to log. It was a perception, not a sense of reading. Imperceptions that can't be confirmed by the instruments belong in the part of the technician's mental space that the job requires you to manage privately. I managed it privately. It was Estrada who told me. Not about the ridge specifically. Not at first. He told me without planning to, which is the only way anything real gets told between people working in tight quarters under sustained pressure. We were doing a crossover between his night shift and my day shift about 6 weeks into my posting. He was doing the handover briefing the way Webb had shown us to, and he got to the NWE anomaly entry, which he had that night as well. 48-minute duration, and he stopped in the middle of describing it and put the logbook down. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the monitoring screens with the particular blankness of a man who's deciding something. Then he said, "Does it say your name?" I looked at him. He was still looking at the screens. K, after the anomaly, through the walls. K nodded. Once. Small. The nod of a man who was relieved and frightened at the same time, which is a specific combination that I understood immediately because I had been there myself. K said, "Don't answer it." He looked at me then, had the eyes of someone who hadn't been sleeping well in a specific and accumulated way. Not the ordinary disruption of shift work, but something underneath it that had been going on longer. "I know," he said. I know not to answer it. There was a pause. The monitoring equipment hummed. The screens swept their data. "How many times?" I said. He counted in his head. Or maybe he already knew and was just deciding whether to say the number out loud. 8, he said. Found a voice that is close to someone I know. "I'm not going to say who," I said. "It gets closer each time." He said, "Yes." I thought about item 4. By the 3rd or 4th time, it will have found a voice closer to you. Estrada had been here 8 months. He'd had 8 calls at minimum, probably more. The voice was already close. Someone he knew. Someone whose voice lived in his body at the level that recognition lives before the brain catches up. I said, "Did you find the card?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes, okay." I said, "In the first aid kit?" "Yes." I said, "All 7 items?" He said, "I found it in my 2nd week." I read it then. I read it again the first time it said my name. "Have you talked to Webb about any of it?" He looked away. "No," he said, which told me everything about what he thought of Webb that the person who wrote the card had already suggested. We sat there for a moment in the operations room with the morning coming in through the high windows, the gray early light of a South Texas October, and the screens showing the empty corridor and the empty compound and the northwest ridge sitting where it always sat against the brightening sky. Estrada stood up. Kay said, "I'm finishing this contract in 3 weeks. I'm not renewing." I said, "Good." Kay said it like he was saying something he'd been holding for a while. Like the act of saying it out loud was part of making it true. 3 weeks later, Estrada's last shift ended at 06:00. He packed his truck in the morning light. I was in the yard when he was loading it. He shook my hand, and I shook his, and neither of us said very much, because there wasn't a form for what we might have said. He drove out the gate. I watched the white dust of the access road settle behind the truck until it was gone, and then until it had been gone long enough that there was nothing left to watch. Then I went inside and sat down at the monitoring chair. That morning, Webb told me the new rotation member would arrive in 2 weeks. A man named Paul Garrett. 6 years of remote monitoring experience, 2 of them with the border-adjacent contractor in the Southwest. Technically strong. Good background check. Available immediately. I said that sounded like a solid hire. Webb said, "He'll settle in fast." There it was again. That phrase. It's a specific phrasing that I'd heard on my first day and filed without knowing why. I thought about Paul Garrett arriving in 2 weeks. I thought about the card in the first aid kit and whether it was still there, and whether it would still be the right card for someone arriving in 2 weeks, or whether 2 weeks was long enough that I should update it, add to it, leave something more recent. I thought about what I would add. Item 8. Maybe. The voice finds the closest one. If you are closest, it finds you fastest. The closer it gets, the more ordinary the pull becomes. That is the danger. Not that it sounds wrong, but that it sounds right. It sounds like someone you'd go to without thinking, or maybe not an addition. Maybe a new card entirely, written in my handwriting on whatever paper I could find, laminated with the laminator web used for the site maps and the protocol cards, placed on top of the old card where someone would see both. Written because it needed to exist outside my own head, 'cause the rules that keep you inside and in the light need to be findable by the person who comes after you in the moment when they need them and can't manufacture them on their own. That's the thing about this work. It's not the border monitoring, not the sensor maintenance, not any of the technical work. Geez, the other work. The work of carrying what you know and deciding what to do with it. Of understanding that you're in a position where what you know has value to someone who comes after you, and that the form the knowledge takes matters as much as the knowledge itself. Terry Okafor had understood that. She'd written it down and laminated it and put it in the first aid kit where a scared person would eventually reach. Alvin had understood it. He'd written his 7 rules and put them under the emergency blanket and spent 19 years passing the essentials off as common sense. So, they'd go down without resistance and stay. I understood it now. It's 8 weeks in, with the NWOARA anomaly occurring consistently on overnight shifts, with my name having been called twice through the walls of the operations room from the direction of the Northwest Ridge, with the full certain knowledge that the voice it had settled on was not Webb's voice or Diaz's voice, but a voice from my life before this posting, a voice that lived deep enough in me that hearing it through the wall of a metal building at 2 in the morning made my hand go to the door handle before I decided anything. I understood it. The rules had held because I'd found them. They'd held because someone had cared enough to make them findable. I went to the equipment storage room. I found the first aid kit. I opened it and took out the card and read all 7 items again, standing under the equipment room light at 7 in the morning, fully awake, reading 7 items I already knew by heart. I read them because reading them was the discipline, 'cause keeping them active in my conscious mind rather than letting them settle into the background where they couldn't catch me in the moment was the whole point. Then I put the card back. Then I went to the desk in the operations room and I got out my field notebook and I started writing. Not the log, not a formal report, not anything with a box of 4 lines and a vocabulary pre-selected to contain it. I wrote everything, what the anomaly sounded like through the speakers before I turned the volume down. What it sounded like through the walls. The first time my name came through the walls, what it felt like to have my hand on the door handle without having decided to put it there. The specific cadence of the voice it had chosen. The way I could feel the pull of the Northwest Ridge on overnight shifts, the way you feel a physical presence at the edge of your vision, something your peripheral awareness keeps registering even when you're committed to not looking. I wrote it the way the person in the Canadian log yard had written their account, not for Meridian Field Services, not for WorkSafe BC or DHS or anyone with a form. It's for whoever came after. For Paul Garrett arriving in 2 weeks, or for the person after Paul Garrett, or for the person after them, because the station was going to stay open. I understood that now the way the log yard technician had understood that the yard was going to keep running. The math had been done. The decision had been made at a level I would never have access to. And the decision was that the station was worth keeping open, and that the anomaly, the ridge, the voice in the walls, all of it fell inside the acceptable parameters of an operational remote monitoring installation on a critical corridor. Insurance doesn't cover it. That's the sentence I keep coming back to when I think about Webb, about what he knows and what he's chosen not to say. About 14 months of Terry Okafor and 8 months of Danny Estrada and however many others before them whose names aren't in any log entry I've found. Somebody did the math. The math said the station stays open. I'm still here. I've got 4 weeks left on my initial contract, and I've been thinking about what comes after. The renewal form arrived in my email last week, Standard terms. Same pay scale. Note from Sandra Reyes at Meridian saying she hoped the posting had been a good fit and that she looked forward to hearing from me. I haven't replied. What I've been doing instead is writing the end of every overnight shift after the 0600 Del Rio status call and before Webb arrives for the day briefing. I write. The field notebook is nearly full. I've started on a second one. I don't know what shape it's going to take eventually. I don't know if there's a shape that holds all of it. I know that the 4-line box on Axel Simpson's form doesn't hold it. I know that the sensor anomaly field in the operations room log doesn't hold it. Okay? I know that the language available to me inside the structures that exist for this kind of work is not the right size for what I'm trying to describe. But I also know that Terry Okafor managed to say what she needed to say on a single laminated card in 12 point times. Typed, not handwritten, because a printer is more legible than handwriting in a moment of stress, and she thought about that. She thought about who was going to be reading it and under what conditions and what they were going to need from it in that moment. That's the discipline. It's writing for the person who needs it, not for yourself. I'm still working on that part. Last night, the anomaly ran for 83 minutes, had the speaker volume at 0 from the first moment. The screens were clear. The perimeter was clear. I did the building walks at 90-minute intervals with all lights burning in every room. At 0247, my name came through the north wall. It was the voice I've described. The one that belongs to someone whose presence in my life is deep enough that hearing it through the wall of a metal building in 67 miles of scrubland made something in my chest do the thing it does. It's not my heart specifically, something adjacent to my heart. Something that doesn't have a precise anatomical name. I was in the monitoring chair. My hands were flat on the desk. Eyes were on the screens in the sweep pattern. I did not respond. I did not go to the window. I did not go to the door. I sat with my hands flat on the desk, and I watched the screens, and I counted my breaths in the 40s, and I waited for it to stop. It stopped at 0251, 4 minutes, short, clean. The silence after it was the silence of a place that had been waiting and was now waiting differently. I logged 0247, exterior acoustic event, apparent voice transmission, north side of building. No sensor activity. No action taken. Continued monitoring. Then I sat with the field notebook open in front of me, and I wrote for the next hour and 15 minutes until it was time for the Del Rio status call. I have not looked at the northwest ridge from any camera angle in 11 days. I have not gone north of the perimeter fence. I have not answered the voice. Paul Garrett arrives Tuesday. I will meet him at the gate. I will walk him through the station. I will show him the monitoring equipment and explain the logging protocol and give him the 3 pieces of information that Webb gave me on the first day. The path, the radio anomaly, the light. In exactly the way that Webb gave them to me. Flat and practical, and folded into the machinery orientation so that they go down without resistance and stay. And then I will find a moment after the first overnight. After Paul Garrett has had the anomaly for the first time and logged it as sensor interference, the way the protocol says to, I will find a moment and I will walk him to the equipment storage room and I will open the first aid kit and I will put it in his hands. Because that's the work. That's the actual work. Everything else is just what happens around it. Paul Garrett called me on a Friday morning, 2 weeks after Webb's call. Earlier than I expected, which was itself information. So I answered on the second ring. He said, Cole. I said, yes. He said, I need to tell you something. I said, tell me. He said, I found a second card. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, I put it there. He said, I know, okay? I can tell the difference in the writing, but that's not what I'm calling about. I said, what are you calling about? Kay said, under Terry's card and your card, under the emergency blanket, there was a third card. The room I was sitting in was very quiet. I was at my kitchen table in an apartment 600 miles north of Del Rio. The generator was not humming, okay? The monitoring screens were not sweeping their data. The Northwest Ridge was not anywhere I could see it. I said, "What did it say?" He said, "It was older than Terry's. The lamination had yellowed at the edges. The date was 8 years ago. Different handwriting. Someone named Reyes. From context, I think it was a woman named Reyes, based on the pronouns. 5 items, not 7. I said, "Same rules?" He said, "The same rules. Slightly different framing. She didn't have the language about the speaker volume. Do not listen to the voice from the Northwest through any amplified system, but the same rule. She had, when it knows your name, it is already working. She had, the lights are not optional." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Cole, how long has this been going on?" I looked at my kitchen table, my coffee, the field notebooks stacked at the edge where I've been working through them, trying to make them into the shape of something that someone could read and understand and use. I said, "Longer than 8 years." He said, "There's another card under Reyes's card." I stopped breathing for a moment. Then I started again. I said, "How old?" He said, "Older. The lamination is cracked. The paper inside has yellowed significantly. The date is, the ink is faded in places. I think it says something like 2004, but I'm not sure of the last digit. Different handwriting again, 4 items. The station must have had different equipment then, because the first item references something called the audio array, not the NW array, but the same rule. Turn off the audio system when the voice starts." I said, "Paul." He said, "Yes." I said, "Are there more under that one?" He said, "I haven't looked yet. I called you first." I said, "Look." There was a long pause. I heard him moving, the equipment storage room acoustic coming through the phone, the specific echo of that space. The hum of a facility that doesn't stop running, not for night, not for day, not for the discovery of something that rewrites the history of what's been happening in that location. Then he said, "Yes, one word. The word of a man who has opened something and is looking at what's inside and understanding that what he's looking at is larger than he anticipated." I said, "How many?" He said, "I count 9 cards total. The bottom one is, the lamination has delaminated completely. The card inside is a handwritten sheet, that is, the paper is significantly degraded. I can make out partial text. The handwriting is very old, not stylistically old, actually old, the kind of old that paper gets when it's been protected and layered and kept in darkness for a very long time. 9 cards, the number set between us on the phone line. 9 people, 9 iterations of the same rules. 9 versions of survival, documented and refined and passed forward through time in a first aid kit in an equipment storage room that most people would walk past without thinking twice. 9 people who had known what I knew, who had sat in the monitoring chair at 0011 with their hands on the desk, who had heard the voice through the north wall and read the rules in their heads and stayed in their chairs, or who had not. We don't know which of those 9 stayed and which of them had their car found at the north gate in the morning. We don't know. The log entries go back 26 months, and the cards go back further than that, and somewhere in the distance between those 2 data points is the answer to how long the Northwest Ridge has been doing what it does, and how many people have been in that operations room, and how many of them came home. I said, "Paul, are you okay?" He said, "Yes, I think so. I'm processing what this means." I said, "Are you on shift right now?" He said, "Day shift. Webb is here." I said, "Is Webb there with you?" He said, "He's in the operations room. I stepped out to call you. I'm in the corridor." I said, "Go back in with Webb. Tell him about the cards. Show him the stack. Tell him Cole knows. Tell him I said to show you what comes next." There was a pause. I realized I'd said something that surprised him. He said, "What comes next?" "There's something else." I said, "There has to be something else. Go look, Paul. After the 9th card." after the oldest one. There has to be something else. I heard him moving. The corridor of the station. The pre-engineered metal building that has been standing in Valverde County for longer than anyone currently alive has been monitoring it. I heard the equipment storage room again, the specific acoustic of that space. And then I heard him opening the first aid kit. He said, "There's a folder." I said, "What's in it?" He said, "Photographs. They're old. The color has shifted the way color shifts in old photographs, okay? And there, Cole, these are photographs of the ridge. Specific photographs, shot from different angles, different times of day. Thermal imagery, regular spectrum, and there are marks on them, annotations, lines drawn connecting points." I said, "Read me the annotations." He said, "This first one, it says excavation attempt, 1987. The next one says excavation abandoned. Subsidence event, 3 fatalities. The next one says structural mapping attempt, 1992, incomplete, 2 personnel lost. Then it says monitoring established 1997, continuous presence determined necessary. Okay. The next photograph has a date stamp, 1999, and it says audio manifestation begins, pattern analysis ongoing. He was reading like a man who was discovering that everything he thought he understood about the station is incomplete, that the rules he was given and the cards that were left were not the beginning of the story but the middle, that something had been happening here long before Terry Okafor wrote her 7 items. I said, "Paul?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Keep reading." He said, "The rest of the annotations are, they're handwritten in different hands, multiple people, different times. This one says, manifestation intensifies during lunar cycle. This one says, voice transmission through electronic systems established 2005. This one says, human contact attempts ceased 2008, 1 death resulting. This one says, protocol established 2009, survival rate improved. This one says, ridge structure appears to be point of convergence or locus, exact nature unknown, federal assessment ongoing. This one says, containment strategy adopted 2012, permanent posting authorized. This one says, 18 years of continuous observation, manifestation behavior remains consistent, intelligence assessment inconclusive. 18 years. The number changed everything. Not 8 years. Not the span of the cards in the first aid kit. 18 years of observation and documentation and people arriving at this station and learning to survive it and writing down what they learned. I said, Paul, is there a name on those annotations? He said, multiple names. I can see signatures, different people, different times. The earliest ones are signed by someone named Garrett. I said, Garrett. He said, that's my last name. The line went quiet. I could hear him standing in the equipment storage room of a remote border monitoring station in Texas, holding a folder of photographs that documented something that shouldn't exist according to every official system we have access to. His last name on documents that are 18 years old. I said, Paul. He said, yes. I said, what's your full name? He said, Paul James Garrett. I said, do you know anyone named Garrett? Anyone in your family with a connection to border work? He said, my uncle, my father's brother, worked in border security for DHS in the late 90s and early 2000s. He was at an installation in Texas for a few years. I never knew exactly where. My father didn't like to talk about it. My uncle died in 2008. Car accident, they said. Single vehicle on a rural road. No other details. I said, Paul. He said, yes. I said, I think your uncle was at the station. The silence that followed was the silence of a man understanding that the thing he signed up to monitor, it's the thing he thought he was just beginning to understand through the cards and the rules in my account of what I experienced. That thing had reached back into his family history and touched his uncle and killed his uncle and now brought him to the same location 20 years later. I said, Paul, the photographs, is there anything else? He said, yes, there's a final annotation, stated 2008, the date of your uncle's death. And it says, final attempt to establish contact resulted in perimeter breach and fatality. Subsequent protocol revision established. No further contact attempts authorized. Monitoring and documentation only. Federal oversight classification elevated. Current status. Active anomaly. Containment protocol established. Civilian personnel cycle rotation recommended. I said. He went outside. Paul said. Yes. Kai said. To the north gate. He said. Probably. Almost certainly. I said. And it reached him the way it reaches people, using his own experience and his own grief and whatever was in him that wanted to understand what was happening. He said, yes. I said, Paul, are you still willing to be there? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, yes. I said, why? He said, because he didn't have cards. He didn't have the rules written down by people who came before him, had to learn it on his own, and the learning killed him. But now the cards exist. Now the rules are there. Now someone else doesn't have to die to understand what stays in the light and what lives in the dark. He said, I'm staying. I said, thank you. He said, Cole, you need to add to the account. I said, what do you mean? He said, this section, the photographs, the 18 years, is your uncle knowing. You need to write all of it down. You need to complete the documentation. I said, I thought the account was finished. He said, it was, but now it's not. The station has a history that goes back further than you knew, and you need to document it. You need to make it clear that this isn't something that started when Terry Okafor arrived. This has been happening since 1987 at minimum. Before the cards, before the rules, before the structure that kept me alive was even built. I said, Paul, if I do that, if I put that in the account, if I document that your uncle died there and that DHS has been monitoring this location and has decided to keep it running, it has decided to cycle civilians through it with minimal information, if I put that in an account that someone will eventually read, I might be putting you in a position where someone asks questions about whether you should have known, whether you should have left, whether you should have. He said, I know. Said, you know. He said, I know what you're about to say. Hey, and I'm saying that the cost of truth is part of the cost. My uncle paid it. Your Uncle Webb is paying it in Arizona. Terry Okafor paid it. I'm going to pay it too, but the next person doesn't have to pay it in the same way if they know what they're walking toward. He said, document it, all of it, put my uncle's name in it. Put the photograph annotations. Put the 18 years. Make it complete, and put it in the first aid kit, under the photographs. Okay, so whoever comes next knows that they're not just following rules. Okay, they are following the accumulated knowledge of people who went into the dark, and some of them didn't come back, and everyone who stayed understood why it mattered to write it down. I said, okay. He said, thank you. He hung up. The weight of that conversation has been sitting with me for 3 days. I haven't left my apartment. I've been sitting at this table in the light with every lamp I own burning, and I've been trying to figure out how to write what comes next. Because Paul is right. This account is not complete without this section. Supplying the rules and the cards and the survival strategies only make sense if you understand the context. And the context is that this has been happening for at least 20 years. Okay. That DHS knows about it. Okay. That they've decided the location is strategically significant enough to justify keeping a monitoring station there despite the anomalies. Okay. That they've made peace with a certain level of personnel loss as an acceptable cost of maintaining that presence. Okay. Insurance doesn't cover it. Those words from the story of the Canadian log yard. Okay. Those words sit at the same conceptual level as the 18 years and the photographs and the decision that the station stays open. A decision made by someone at a desk in an office somewhere. A decision that said, this location matters more than the safety of the people we assign to it. But it also saved me. That's the part I have to sit with, and that I have to be honest about. It's the fact that DHS had been monitoring the location and had accumulated decades of knowledge about how to survive it and how to document it meant that the rules existed when I arrived, meant that the cards were in the first aid kit, meant that I had every protection that 18 years of accumulated experience could provide. The fact that my Uncle Webb was there and carried the knowledge from his first week as a junior technician until the moment he did the work and left and went to Arizona, that protected me. The fact that someone named Garrett, possibly Paul's own uncle, wrote annotations on photographs in 2008, that protected me. The decision to keep the station running despite knowing what was there. The decision that killed some people and protected others, that decision protected me. I don't know what to do with that knowledge. I don't know if I'm supposed to feel grateful or complicit or both. What I know is that I have to document it. I have to write down the 18 years and the photographs and the excavation attempts that failed and past stations that began in 2005 and the person named Garrett who died in 2008 and the federal assessment that found the situation inconclusive and decided to keep monitoring. Anyway, I have to write it down because Paul asked me to and because he's right that the next person deserves to know the full weight of what they're walking toward. The photographs that Paul described, I haven't seen them. They're in the first aid kit in the equipment storage room of the station. But I can construct a picture of them from his descriptions and from what I know about the ridge and from the 18 years of documentation that exists outside my experience. The earliest photographs would be from 1987, the excavation attempt. I don't know what DHS was looking for or what they were trying to do. I don't know what they thought was under the ridge, but 3 people died trying to find out. It's documented in the annotations. That's a specific fact. Excavation, abandoned, subsidence event, 3 fatalities. Subsidence event. The ground gave way, or something made it give way, or the act of digging into the ridge triggered something that caused the ground to fail. I don't know which. But whatever happened, 3 people died and the excavation stopped. Then 5 years of nothing, or not nothing. 5 years of observation and calculation and decision-making. Then, 1992, another attempt, a structural mapping attempt this time. It's more cautious, presumably. They weren't digging, they were measuring. They were trying to understand the composition of the ridge from the outside rather than the inside. 2 personnel lost, the attempt abandoned. Then, 5 more years of assessment and recalibration. And in 1997, the decision, monitoring, established, continuous presence, determined necessary. Someone at DHS made that decision. Someone looked at the evidence from 1987 and 1992 and from 5 years of observation and decided that the ridge needed to be watched, that a monitoring station was necessary, that continuous presence would somehow change what was happening, or would at least provide early warning, or would provide data that might be useful at some future point when understanding of the phenomena improved. The station was built for that purpose, not to control what was on the ridge, to observe it, to document it, take a record of what it did and how it manifested and what changes occurred in its behavior over time. And then in 1999, something changed. Audio manifestation begins, pattern analysis ongoing. The voice, the thing that I heard on the NW array speakers, the thing that came through the north wall saying my name, the thing that Terry Okafor documented and that I documented and that Paul is now documenting. Keen in 1999, that started. Or the documentation of it started. Maybe it had always been happening and people just didn't have the word for it until 1999. Maybe it was new. I don't know. But someone looking at the photographs from 1999 would see the moment when the ridge's behavior shifted to include audio manifestations. When it started using voices, pattern analysis ongoing. They were studying the pattern, trying to understand when it happened, what triggered it, what voices it used, what the manifestations communicated. 18 years of pattern analysis. 18 years of standing at the monitoring station and logging every occurrence and trying to find meaning in the patterns. And, in 2005, the annotation says, voice transmission through electronic systems established. Not just audio manifestations in the scrub land. It's audio transmission through the monitoring equipment, through the speakers in the operations room, through the systems that were supposed to be observing the ridge. That's when the station became dangerous in the specific way I experienced it. When the voice could reach inside, when it could use the equipment designed to observe it. And then, in 2008, the annotation on the photograph from my Uncle Garrett says, human contact attempts cease 2008, 1 death resulting. My uncle went to the North Gate. He tried to make contact. He tried to bridge the gap between the observation and the thing being observed, and it killed him. And immediately after, the annotation says, protocol established 2009, survival rate improved. The rules were written. Not because anyone understood what would save you, but because someone, probably someone close to my uncle, understood that what had killed him was the absence of rules. That if you gave new arrivals the rules in advance, if you told them not to answer the voice, if you told them to keep the lights on, if you gave them the knowledge that had been accumulated at such cost, their survival rate improved. My uncle's death led to the rules. The rules led to the cards. The cards led to my survival. That's the chain. It's the shape of it. I've been thinking about Paul's uncle constantly since this conversation. It's trying to imagine what it was like to be at the station in 2008, before the cards, before the rules, before anyone had documented how to survive what was happening. It's the photographs and the annotations and a person at a desk somewhere who had decided that understanding the ridge was worth the cost of sending people to observe it. He would have had the basic orientation, the east path, probably, some version of it. The radio anomaly warning, maybe just the lights. Maybe just keep the lights on, and maybe that was enough to keep him safe for a while. Maybe he did his shifts and logged his entries and called the sector office at 0600 and maintained the appearance of normalcy that the monitoring station existed to maintain. And one night, something in the configuration of the rules or the pull from the ridge or the specific shape of his own grief found the gap, found the thing in him that wanted to understand or that wanted to resolve something, or that was tired of staying in the light. And he went to the North Gate, and it killed him. And the next day, or the next week, or at the point when the incident report had been filed and the assessment had been done, someone with authority made the decision that the station would stay open, but the protocols would be revised. The rules would be written down. It's not just passed verbally from one technician to the next. Documented, laminated, made permanent. My uncle's death was the cost of making that decision. Everything that came after, all the people who came to the station and read the rules before their first overnight, all of them benefited from my uncle's death. They had the protection he didn't have. I don't know if he would have wanted that. I don't know if he would have felt that his death meant something in the context of protecting people who came after him. But that's what happened. That's the shape of the chain. I've decided to add this final section to the account. Tall is right that it needs to be complete. The rules and the cards only make sense if you understand that they came from somewhere, that they cost something, that they were written because people died and someone decided that documenting how to survive was worth doing. I'm going to send this complete version to Paul. He would put it in the first aid kit, under the photographs, under the cards, in the order that makes sense chronologically and thematically. The oldest documentation first. The photographs and annotations from 1987 onwards. Then the cards, 9 of them, documenting the rules as they developed and were refined and became more complete than my account of what I experienced. Then Webb's additions about the cost in the North Gate, and Paul's documentation of what he's learned since opening the first aid kit. Okay? Then this final section, which ties it all together and explains the shape of it. A complete history, not complete in the sense of finished or final, because there will be more. More cards will be added. More people will come and experience it and understand it and write it down. The first aid kit will keep growing, but complete in the sense that anyone who opens it will understand the full scope of what has been happening from 1987 onwards, from the excavation attempts, through the audio manifestations, through the death in 2008, through the rules being established, through my experience, through Webb's transfer, through this moment right now. They will understand that they are not the first, that they are part of a chain of survival that is now 20 years long. The people have died so that they could have the rules. They will understand that staying in the light is possible. The last thing I want to say is something that I've been circling around throughout all of this, but haven't directly named. The thing on the Northwest Ridge is not going away. The photographs going back to 1987 prove that. 18 years of documentation proves that. The decision to keep this station open, despite knowing about the manifestations, proves that. This is permanent. This is the new geography of that location. This is what that place is now, and the rules work. They have been tested by 10 people now across at least 3 iterations, and the rules work. They keep you in your chair. They keep you in the light. They keep your hands on the desk and your eyes on the screens and your focus on doing your shift and calling Del Rio at 0600 and going home when your contract ends. But the rules don't change what's there. That's important. That's the final thing I need to say clearly. The rules are not about solving the problem. The rules are about surviving in the presence of the problem. You don't go to the Northwest Ridge and close it down or destroy it or resolve it. You accept that it exists. You document it. You keep it on the other side of the north wall of a metal building through the force of discipline and light and the knowledge that the people before you found what worked. That's the actual win. Not defeating the thing, surviving alongside it, living in a facility that is fundamentally contained by it, doing a job that is fundamentally an exercise in observation and management of a dangerous situation. Understanding that you are not going to close the case or solve the problem. You are going to hold the line. That's what the rules are for. That's what all of this documentation is for. To help people hold the line. I'm going to send this account to Paul Garrett now. All of it. Every word, every section. It's the beginning where I described the first orientation. It's the middle where I documented what I experienced. The end where I'm explaining the 18 years and the death in 2008 and the rules that came from that death. He will receive it and he will read it and he will put it in the first aid kit under the photographs, under the 9 cards. And then someone will come next. Someone will arrive on a float plane or drive the 67 miles, and someone will stand in the yard, do the recalibration, and someone will go to the operations room for the first time and sit in the monitoring chair, and someone will open, okay? The first aid kit when they're scared, and they will find all of this. They will find the photographs and the cards and the account and the rules, and they will understand what it takes to survive in that location. They will keep the lights on. They will not answer the voice. They will stay in their chair. They will do their shift, and they will log their entries, and they will call Del Rio at 0600, and they will go home when their contract ends. And if they're strong enough, and if they care enough, and if they understand what the people before them learned, they will add to the documentation. They will write it down. They will laminate it. They will put it in the first aid kit. They will pass the work on. That's the only victory that's possible in a place like that. Not ending it, surviving it, documenting it, passing the knowledge on. That's enough. It has to be enough, 'cause it's all we can do. Final account submitted to Paul Garrett, Border Support Technician, Remote Station 7, Val Verde County, Texas. Complete documentation from initial orientation through final analysis. For placement in equipment, storage room, first aid kit, under the photographs and cards, where it can be found by whoever comes next. Includes initial arrival in orientation with Marcus Webb escalation of anomalies over 8 weeks of employment. First discovery of the laminated card in the first aid kit. The voice through the north wall and the cost of refusing it. Account of the north gate and the depth of knowledge at the station. The written cards documenting years of accumulated survival strategies. The discovery of the photographs and the 18-year history. The revelation that my assigned supervisor was a relative of a man who died at this location in 2008. The complete chain of knowledge from 1987 to present day. Final analysis of what the rules mean and why they matter. The station is real. The Northwest Ridge is real. The voice is real. The cost is real. Keep every light on. Do your shift. Carry the knowledge forward. That's the work. That's all the work. It's everything. Cole Rutledge, former Border Support Technician, Remote Station 7, Val Verde County, Texas. Completed October 17th, 11:47 p.m. All lights on in this apartment. Will remain on indefinitely. The work continues. Let's pass it on.